So my name is Mike. I am a data scientist at the British Red Cross on the Insight and Foresight team. And today I'm going to talk to you about open source in the social sector and why it matters. So to get started, I'd like us to cast our minds back to the 23rd of March, 2020. It was the date that Boris Johnson and the government announced the first national local lockdown measures, and it kind of represented a shift in the way we're going to view the world for the next year, and it's still ongoing. Now, this time for everyone in the social sector represented a shift in the way we have to work. And for us at the British Red Cross, we had to come up with new ways of working. In my team, my colleagues developed the COVID-19 Vulnerability Index. For those of you who aren't familiar with this tool, it is similar to the indices of multiple deprivation, and it models deprivation across the country. But instead of deprivation, we model vulnerability and vulnerability to the effects of COVID, be that the economic, social, health and well-being, or kind of overall vulnerability. We can do this at local authority level and middle super output area level. Now, there's something different about this tool than some of our other tools we make at the British Red Cross, and that was that it's open source. You can see on the slide there's a link at the bottom in grey, where you can go and view the code and all the things we use to make this, and you can use this yourself. We'll get onto this more shortly. Now, this kind of change into open source has propagated through into the other tools we use in our team at the British Red Cross. It's kind of been a small cultural shift. So here's another tool we recently released, which models NHS capacity at the local trust level. And just like the Vulnerability Index, this is open source and is out there for the whole community to benefit from. And this idea is now propagating through into other tools we're making, matching our strategic causes moving forward. So when we're making tools in the social sector, we kind of have this choice between going down an open source route and a proprietary route. Now, these terms aren't technically discrete entities and separate ideas. You can use proprietary tools to release things in the open, but for all intents and purposes, we can kind of think of these separate paths. And we took this open source path. And today I'm going to talk about why you might want to go down this path if you haven't already, and some of the benefits it can bring. So, what do we mean by open source? There's a nice quote here from Nadia Eghbal, who wrote a book on kind of the trials and tribulations of publishing open source software. And she said, open source software, a term that's nearly synonymous with public collaboration, where developers write and publish code that anybody can use. So what does this mean? Well, I think the best way to conceptualize this is with a metaphor. Using proprietary tools, and this is tools where you don't write and publish code, so things maybe like Microsoft Excel, Power BI, Tableau, using these kind of proprietary tools is kind of like doing analysis, it's doing analysis which is kind of like making a loaf of bread. The bread has a one-time use value. It's nourishing, it certainly has value, but it's kind of limited in its scope and how far it can go. Contrast that to writing and publishing code. We can think of that as like giving a recipe for the bread instead. So not only can you give the bread, you can give people the exact recipe to create that bread. And you might want to do that for a few reasons. One, they can give you feedback on your recipe and say, hey, you put too much salt in, take the salt out. Or they can take the recipe and adapt it to their needs, to better their wants and requirements. So it kind of has this mutual beneficial relationship. And then that recipe can go out into the world and propagate through to everyone. It's not limited in its kind of usage. So that's how we kind of see proprietary versus open source tools. The difference is when we talk about the ingredients of a loaf of bread in an analysis context in the social sector, we're talking about code. So the code is the ingredients. Now, when I say the word code, a lot of people just think of something like this. Green text running down the screen, things are in the matrix, and it's overwhelming, and then you might feel like this, and you start to panic. Well, I urge you not to panic, because this is not what using open source software is about, and this is not what coding is about. Not in my experience anyway. It's much more akin to writing English prose than it is to doing hardcore mathematics. So, what does open source mean for you pragmatically? We have this idea, it's about writing and publishing code, and we have this idea, it's kind of like giving a recipe for a loaf of bread. Now, I want to return back to this quote, but this time I want to emphasize two words: write and publish. Now, the reason I want to emphasize these words is when I was writing these slides, I was reflecting what it means to write open source software. And I figured you could actually tease these ideas apart. Well, to produce open source software, you have to both write and publish code. You could actually just write code and take a lot of the benefits of using open source software in your organization without actually doing the publishing. Now, that won't bring about all the benefits that writing open source software has, but I think it's a nice distinction to make. That if you're thinking about adopting some open source software in your organization, charity, sector, you don't have to do both of these things. But why would you want to do both or one? And what are some of the benefits it might bring? Well, the first benefit is it benefits you as analysts, as an organization. So here is a screenshot taken from the COVID-19 vulnerability index I introduced earlier. And it's a list of the contributors who have added code to that tool. Now, the top one, Matt, my colleague, wrote most of the code, and there's myself, who was a major contributor, Mike. But below that, we see two names, Obi and Tom. Now, they both added significant contributions to our work, added significant analytical contributions we couldn't otherwise have made without serious investment of time. And they massively benefited our work and improved the kind of rigor and validity. Now, why might they want to do that? Well, there's a benefit to them as well, because they get to use what we've done, add to it, and turn it into their own use cases. It's also great for their careers and CV to say, hey, I've contributed to this thing for the greater good. So speaking of contributing outwards, by writing open source software and releasing your code out to the public, there's a massive benefit as well for the community, outside of the analytical data science community. Here's a screenshot taken from our impact summary of the vulnerability index. And as we can see, the tool was used across councils, foundations, and organizations, such as the National Lottery Community Fund and Somerset Community Foundation. And it's really rewarding as an analyst and someone in data to see the work having an impact outside of the small sphere of your organization into the greater good. This is a massive benefit of writing open source software. It really propagates out for the greater good. This next benefit is more a benefit for you as analysts, as data practitioners, and that is you get to write reproducible work. And this kind of means two things. The first one is the work is scientifically rigorous and valid if it's reproducible. Just like we want to write down our research methods when doing an experiment, we want to write down our analytical process when doing an analysis. This allows others and yourself to spot mistakes you might not have otherwise seen. If you're dragging and dropping fields around in Microsoft Excel, for example, you might introduce a mistake you don't spot, and that could propagate through and have a massive impact on your analysis. Whereas by writing code, like a set of instructions, like a set of ingredients in a recipe list, it's very easy to spot mistakes, and it's very easy for others to correct the work you've done, which really adds scientific rigor and validity. And the second massive benefit of having reproducible work is you can create little templates you can morph and change to different use cases. So here's a code snippet taken to model unemployment data in Scotland. Not only can I go to this in the future and just recreate what I've done, I can also kind of tweak this into another purpose, just using this as a template, and it really is a massive time saver. And the final benefit I'm going to talk about today is it's free. Now, there is a distinction between free software and open source software, but it's kind of very nuanced, and for all intents and purposes, we can think of them as the same thing for this session. So we aren't in the private sector, we don't have huge budgets necessarily to invest in software. I think being able to bring in powerful free tools can be a massive benefit, especially when on a budget. So far, I've kind of painted a picture that open source is this amazing saving grace and proprietary tools are the devil. Now, that is not the case, and that is not the argument I'm trying to make. Proprietary tools certainly have their place. What I'm trying to present is that I think the benefits of open source massively outweigh the negatives. So, what are the negatives though? Like, what do we need to consider? Well, even if you're just writing and publishing, and you're just starting out, there's a very steep learning curve to shift into an open source model, to shift into writing code and publishing code. This graph really sums it up nicely. So you start off, you're really excited, you're like, yeah, I'm writing code, you think it's amazing, and suddenly you get lots of bugs, you have no idea what's going on, you don't understand how anything works, and you just hate Python, you hate R, whatever you're writing in, and you don't know why you did this. But once you get over that hump, and the growth in productivity is just exponential, and you can just do so much more than you previously could. So I know I'm kind of portraying this as a strength when I said this is a risk, but it's something to consider if you're new to this and you're thinking about switching to code, switching to open source. Like, there is a significant overhead, but I think in the long-term investment is certainly worthy of investment. The next consideration or risk is licensing. Now, writing open source software and publishing code out in the open, it's not just willy-nilly just letting it be out there. You need to think about licensing. You need to think about, how is this code going to be used? How can I manage the responsibility of it? How can I make sure it isn't misused? Now, this is a risk if you're not familiar with licensing and you put the wrong license on your software. You need to protect yourselves. You need to protect the work you're doing. Now, addressing that though, there's a nice quote here from Andrew Laurent. He says, although open source licensing is often described as radical, it's built on solid, traditional legal foundations. Now, you may not be aware of this, but a lot of the software we use on a day-to-day basis is actually powered by open source. From our laptops, phones, printers, cars, under the hood, there is a lot of open source code which has gone into powering these things. It has a very strong background, both legally and as an idea. It's not some novel, brash, high-risk concept that you'd want to bring into your organization. It is very solid. Now, if you're very concerned about how your work could be used, there's a spectrum of licenses you can choose from. And the strongest of these are the copyleft licenses. As the quote says, copyleft licenses attach themselves like a virus to any code that uses them. And what this means is that if you release some work under a strong copyleft license out into the open as open source software, anyone who wants to use that work also has to abide and adhere to the same license. So it kind of like self-propagates through. So no one entity can take what you've done and benefit from it and abuse your work for their own greater good. It has to go out into the open and it has to propagate through. So it's very protective. So the work we release on our team at the British Red Cross, we use a GPL3 license. And this is one of these strong copyleft licenses, and it just ensures that our work remains open for everyone to use. So I've talked a lot about the benefits and how you might want to do open source, but I think it's a good question to say is, when would you not want to publish in the open? Now, the first obvious one is you do not want to publish personal data in the open. And there's certainly times when releasing open source software needs to be taken into consideration of GDPR. Now, I think we can separate these concerns slightly. You can still write open source code for the community to benefit from, to share your ideas without releasing the data that matches that code. So if you've come up with a novel way of analyzing something you want to share out in the open for the benefit of the community, you can still do that without releasing the code. It just takes some nuance to do that, but it's certainly something achievable. The second time you might want to release your work out as open source software is you don't want to release business IP, intellectual property. I mean, this could not only be a breach of your organizational policy, but it's also something you need to seriously consider. Like, the reality is, it's a competitive landscape out there to get tenders, to get grants and bids, and maybe it's not necessarily a good thing just to release all of your secrets, all of your best ideas out to the open. But I do challenge this in that perhaps the benefits that doing that will bring can match the risk that comes with being in the open. I certainly want to make you more aware today of the benefits so you can have a better way up of this equation moving forward. So, if you want to do open source, like, how might you go about that? Well, from the writing aspect, there's kind of 3 steps I see. And going back to our metaphor of baking bread, you need to pick a language, which is like writing a recipe as your first step. Now, in the data space, there's really 2 predominant open source software languages that you'd want to use, and that is R and Python. In our team, we predominantly rely on R. I personally think it's a better data language, but that's very much personal preference, and I do not want to get into programming flame wars right now. But we also use Python, and they're both suited perhaps for different use cases. So that's the first step, is to pick a language. The next thing you might want to do after learning how to write code, write your recipes, is store them somewhere. Now, there's a tool called Git, which is really suited for this purpose. It's a nice way to store all your recipes so you can go back through in the future, get those templates out, like I said, and have a way to share, to version control all the work you're doing. Now, this isn't like when you're writing a thesis as a master's student or undergraduate student. You might have draft 1, draft 2, final 1, final master, etc. It's a much more intelligent way of doing it than that, but it has a significant learning overhead. The third step you need to consider when writing open source software is know where to ask for help. You will get stuck a lot, and that's part of the fun, is like working out small puzzles and working out how to break down code. Now, there's 2 places you might want to look. The first one is Stack Overflow. It's a great resource. It's community driven. People put answers in there, and often you'll instantly find the answer you need to the problem you have. The second one is just to use a search engine. It's surprising that if you just copy and paste in errors or problems, how quickly you can find an answer. I mean, my search engine choice is DuckDuckGo for privacy reasons, but anything's really suited. And then from the publishing side, so to really get your work out into the open, you need to pick a publisher, you need to pick a platform to release the code. There's 2 main players, well, there's several main players, but 2 here on the slide are GitHub and GitLab. GitHub is kind of the de facto place to release code. So Git, that tool I mentioned in the previous slide, is where you kind of store your recipes, and then GitHub is where you kind of share those recipes online for the world to see. Once you've done that, you need to make sure you put a license on your work. So just like copyrighting your book with all your recipes, you need to copyright your code, copyright your ideas. There's licenses such as MIT, which are very permissive and free and open, and then there's also licenses like GPL3 I mentioned previously, which are very hard copyleft licenses, which are the more strict side. And probably the right choice for a lot of us in the social sector. Now, the next 2 slides I'm not going to go through. I'll share these and circulate them out afterwards, but they're just some links to some really good resources to get started now. Literally starting from scratch with no experience to full-blown release of open source software out into the world, both from R, Git, and GitHub, for both the writing and publishing steps. Now, to end, I'm going to finish on a quote by these 4 authors who coined a term, catalytic collaboration. What they essentially did is they looked in the social sector for organizations which are having a massive impact, and they identified 4 kind of factors or facets responsible for their impact. And they called these high impact organizations catalytic collaborators. And what they said is, catalytic collaborators focus on equitable access to assets rather than on individual ownership. To ensure this access, they create or leverage open source technology and platforms. I put the emphasis on open source. Not only is it something we found incredibly powerful at the Red Cross, both in terms of the contributions we've received, but the impact we've had, But it seems that others in the space are also recognizing the power that open source can have in the social sector. And I really encourage you to reflect on whether it's something that might benefit both your organization and our sector as a whole. Thank you. I will jump to questions now, but if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to reach out. You can see my email, jump to my website, some more contact details in there, or the bottom thing is my GitHub page where all the code is that I release. So we'll see if any questions have come through. Nothing yet. So any questions, just pop them in the Q&A, and I've got 5 minutes now. There's a question come through from Karen. Thank you. Well, you're welcome. Do you think that open is a theme crossing multiple areas? I'm studying adult online learning course with the OU, and there's a lot in there about open, e.g. OER. So I'm just reflecting on your question. Open is a theme crossing multiple areas. Can you elaborate a little bit, Karen, on what you mean by areas? Do you mean disciplinary fields and sectors? If so, yes. I feel like the social sector is very much behind other sectors in terms of open source. But maybe I'll wait for some more clarity on that. If not, please send me an email. I can address the question more. So a question from Ed. Essentially he asks, is there any good resources about open source licensing? Yes, there's a great website called choosealicense.com. I'll find a way to circulate these slides after and it's on there. But choosealicense.com is a very nice introductory way to navigate the open source licensing space. So rather than having to read through hundreds of pages of legal documentation, they have really nice short summaries of the benefits and costs of each different license. And I find that like a really easy way just to navigate through and pick the right one. So that's choosealicense.com. I'll pop it in the chat as well. So anonymous question. Orgs can often be scared to go OS. What are the ways we can overcome that hesitancy? It's a great question. I actually attended an NHS data science huddle yesterday, and I actually addressed this question with them. They were talking about some of the analysis they did, and I said, is this in the open for us to have a look at, so we can give you some feedback and take some work ourselves? And the answer was no. And when I prompted a bit further, it turned out that there's kind of this cultural fear about how it might be misused and abused. I think the way we can overcome that is involving everyone, all the stakeholders in the chain, from IT to management, and have these nuanced conversations about what it actually means to do open source software. There's this idea that it means releasing all your data and releasing all your ideas, and I think that we can tease these ideas apart and demonstrate not only the benefits it has for the organizations themselves, but also how it mitigates the risks through licensing and other things. I think we can convince people to take this shift to open source. I mean, the open source world in general has been growing rapidly. So GitHub is that platform where we release code. If you look on there, the number of open source projects year on year is growing exponentially. There's a real shift as people are seeing the benefit. I think that's all the questions for now. Maybe wait another minute, and then if something else comes through, please feel free to reach out on my email, and I'll find a way of getting the slides circulated with those resources on. So another question, how do I become part of an OS community and get support? Ooh, good question. So it depends on what OS project you want to work on, but I'll give some examples. In the R community, there is a Twitter group where we hashtag our stats, and often on there people post a lot of open source projects, sometimes asking for help and collaboration, other times not. But the best way to get started in the community is just to find these projects, go to the platform where the code lives, and from there it's quite easy to network with people. You can see issues people are having, you can see requests people have made, and you can jump on them and then maybe pick up a small easy one you can manage and get into the community that way. That's probably the best place, best way to start. In terms of getting support, again, using the platform's chat features, using Twitter and other areas to network with people is the best way. Going to conferences, taking the emails like mine and sending me a message saying, hey, I'm stuck. I'm more than happy to help people out. I found that's the best way to really get started and get the support I need. Question, can we see one of such pages where a project is hosted so everyone can understand better how they look? Yes, sure. How much time have we got left? 3 minutes. So I'll reshare my screen. We're probably going back to the black hole, but hopefully now you can see this page. So this is GitHub. This is the platform I was talking about where we share code. Now, on every page, there's kind of a README section, which is like an introductory way to digest it. So this is from our COVID-19 vulnerability index, and it gives an overview, tells you what it does, how the tool's been built, and then how to run it yourselves, how to contribute, and then some credits with licensed information, and the license can also be found up here. But typically, it looks kind of like a Finder window. It's just a bunch of folders and files with all the code inside of it. And you can navigate through here. And then there's often an issues tab where there's enhancements or problems, and you can jump in the chat and add requests and other such things. Now, it's way too much for this quick short session to describe all the features of GitHub, but essentially there's a place to host code, there's a place to talk about the code. And you can jump and search around for projects.